Pleasure to welcome all of you for the launch of this recently published book, International Sanctions in Practice and Interdisciplinary Perspective. GSIN is an informal seminar series. It was first established a decade ago, largely to foster exchange about international sanctions, interaction and exchange from the vantage point of international Geneva. And the participants typically include scholars along with policy practitioners, many of whom have participated in some of the sanctions training courses that we've offered in conjunction with the UN Secretariat and the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs over the past 6 years. Until recently, the seminar was co-chaired by Erika Moret, who you can see behind me, who's currently up in the mountains on the school holiday. But since she's taken on an important new responsibility as liaison to international organizations in Geneva for Microsoft, I've assumed responsibility for continuing this series. So I wouldn't say that Erika has defected from sanctions. I know she still has a lot of ideas and interest in sanctions, but she is preoccupied with other things at the moment. I should also mention that this book launch is being co-sponsored with the MINOS network. MINOS and I'd like to extend a special welcome to our colleagues from MINOS, which is the Multidisciplinary International Network on Sanctions, which is headquartered at Ghent University in Belgium. It is highly relevant since that's focused on multidisciplinarity, and we have interdisciplinarity perspective in the title of the book that's being launched today. It's a timely work with many insights on contemporary debates about sanctions, with particularly useful insights, I think, on ideas about how to harmonize our language and vocabulary with regard to sanctions, since they're bringing together colleagues from international relations, political science, economics, international law. And sometimes we think we're talking about the same thing, we're using the same word, but we might actually be talking about something different. So they have some very constructive suggestions in their conclusion to that effect, as well as some highly promising ideas for future research. I'm just going to moderate the session. I'm sure I'll have some questions along the way, but we'll give that to our audience, both here in person in Geneva and then online around Europe and perhaps around the world. So we'll start with Erika Moret, currently at Microsoft, and she's the author of the preface. After Erika speaks, I'll turn to Antonio Bultrini, who's going to speak on behalf of the editors first, and then he'll be followed by Francesco Giumelli, Mirko Sossai, and then finally, last but not least, Clara Portela. So Erika, the floor is yours. Look forward to your comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you, first of all, to all the editors of this book. It's been really fantastic working with you, writing the preface and also taking part in the original Florence conference. So a big thank you to everybody, and also to the authors of this book. To those of you who are online or in the room who haven't yet read it, I would strongly recommend that you do. It's a really, really worthwhile read, covering a huge amount of ground on what is a fast-changing field. I am currently joining from the Alps. This is not a pretend filter behind, and I've been jealous of Tom for many years, who always seems to do this. So I thought it was my turn to have a nice background from Gruyere. Sorry to not be there in person. So I would just provide a few minutes of comments based on the content of the preface of which was my contribution to the book, which is to say that, as many of you will know already, sanctions is now impacting all of us. It doesn't matter what sector we work in, what academic discipline we're coming from. Really doesn't matter what part of the world we live in or come from. In some way or another, sanctions will be touching our lives, our work, when we travel, when we do business, and so on. So it really is an ever more prominent field for many people around the world. I always say to students when I'm teaching courses on sanctions that you can pretty much go into any job in the future and you'll probably have to think about sanctions in one form or another. They're becoming more prominent because of a number of reasons. One is that we're seeing something of an impasse at the UN Security Council, where sanctions, multilateral sanctions, have stalled somewhat in recent years. And so making use of sanctions to tackle questions of global peace and security and other UN-focused challenges has become, something hasn't been growing in recent years very much. But at the same time, we've seen this explosion of sanctions use in an autonomous setting, which some people refer to as unilateral sanctions or autonomous sanctions. And this increasingly represent collaborations on sanctions use outside of the UN context. In the preface, I've coined the term, well, I borrowed the term plurilateral sanctions from the trade world, because really we're seeing often 30 or more countries now working together outside of the UN framework to impose sanctions in unison. But at the same time, there isn't one overarching framework to allow these countries to do so. So we're kind of seeing this kind of messy governance of many different legal frameworks working alongside one another in any given context. In that scenario, what we see, of course, is the United States retaining a very prominent role in sanctions practice around the world, and often working closely with what, again, in the preface I term the sanctions quad, which is the US, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada, often working with other partners around the world. Alongside this, we see a growing use in sanctions of sanctions by other actors around the world. In a recent study by a law firm, we see various types of sanctions being used now in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, albeit in no way as prominent a form as the ones I mentioned already. We're also seeing regional organizations starting to employ sanctions with growing frequency across the world, although the European Union remains the only regional organization that's using it as an external form of foreign and security policy. We see sanctions growing in terms of sanctions of other names as well. If we look at countries like Russia and China, they're using sanction type measures in a variety of ways, again with growing frequency in recent years. And of course, China has now introduced its own set of legislation to allow it to make use of some forms of sanctions as well in recent years. We see sanctions being used to tackle a growing number of objectives around the world, really entering into new realms, into new terrains, and a growing number of targets in broadening geographies across the world. If we look at a map of targets that are under sanctions now around the world, most of the world is now covered. There are very few countries that are not being impacted by sanctions today. And we're also seeing new types of sanctions tools, sanctions instruments. We're beyond the traditional targeted sanctions of travel bans, asset freezes, and arms controls. We're now seeing a really explosion of different types of sanctions measures going into new realms, including in the financial sphere. Two final points I'd like to make is that we see this growing complexity of sanctions measures alongside other types of regulations, export controls, criminal laws, counterterrorism measures, anti-money laundering, and combating the financing of terrorism measures, which in unison adds to this complexity of the compliance environment. And so as a consequence, what we now see is financial sector institutions and also other private sector actors growing increasingly reluctant to operate in some of these heavily sanctioned countries around the world. And as a consequence, we're seeing a fragmentation of global trade and global finance around the world. And this is having implications for ordinary people, for the sending of remittances, for humanitarian action, for development assistance, and also for ordinary trade and ordinary finance. So when we look forward 10, 20 years, 30 years into the future, we are likely to see this global fragmentation having an increasing impact in diplomatic relations, in political relations, and so on. And that's a kind of growing area of study. Finally, to say that we're seeing a move over the last 20 years away from targeted sanctions since they were created in the turn of the millennium. And we're now seeing what some of us have termed a recomprehensivization of certain sanctions regimes, where we now see de facto comprehensive measures in a number of countries, again, raising questions over ethics, legality, basic human needs, access to essential goods, and ultimately the age-old question of effectiveness remains an incredibly important one. So I think I'll probably conclude there to say that we have so much more that we need to study as a sanctions community, but this book has really put its mark in terms of making, opening up new inroads when it comes to research and thinking on these important topics. So I'll hand over now to either back to Tom or to Antonio, and thank you very much for having me again today. Bye.
All right, thank you, Erica, very much. It's those of you who have not yet had a chance to read the book or take a look at it. The preface is that Erica drafted is a very comprehensive overview of many of the contemporary issues, as she's just highlighted in her presentation. I think particularly interesting is the way in which we're seeing instruments that are typically justified and applied for political goals or objectives are morphing into more of an economic competition globally with the fragmentation of global trade. So we're seeing this move away from the political into economic motivations, which at least for some of us are not technically sanctions, but just forms of protectionism. We may come back to that later in the discussion. Next, let me turn to Antonio Bultrini. He's an associate professor at the University of Florence, and he is, by alphabet at least, the principal editor of the book. So we'll proceed with your comments, please.
Yes, the first one in alphabetic order anyway. Good morning, everyone. What a pleasure and an honor to be here with you this morning. And I teach international law at the University of Florence, and being the first co-editor to take the floor, my task is to convey a few words of thanks, and to begin with, many thanks indeed to the Global Governance Center of the Graduate Institute for hosting the launch of this book. Many thanks to Thomas, Sylvia, and to Erica too, although she's no longer in the Graduate Institute, for her preface to the book that still stands out as much more than a preface. Many thanks also to MINOS, indeed, and the University of Ghent for co-sponsoring the book, the event. And I should also thank my Department of Economics in Florence that financed the workshop in 2021, which then led to the book that we are presenting today. A Department of Economics financing a workshop organized by a lawyer, myself, and including a good share of political scientists. That was already a strong indication in favor of an interdisciplinary approach to sanctions. And finally, let me also thank the Law Department of Roma III University for co-financing the book together with Florence, and especially Professor Mirko Sossai, whom you will hear in a moment, who gave an important contribution to the workshop and also to co-editing the book. What a great pleasure to have worked together with Francesco, Clara, Mirko, Thomas, Erica, and of course all the authors who contributed to the book. They all brought a huge amount of multidisciplinary expertise on sanctions. Now, having thanked everybody, I hope I haven't forgotten anybody. Let me add now a few remarks on what I see as the added value of this interdisciplinary work, meaning how working on sanctions in an interdisciplinary perspective changed the way in which, for example, I, as a lawyer, now look at sanctions. In other words, what did I learn from this interdisciplinary exercise, and also why do I think that it is very important to approach sanctions with an interdisciplinary method? Now, a lawyer's basic and primary concern relates to the legal basis, what we call legality. And this clearly emerges from most of the contributions that lawyers gave to the book, especially the chapters by Daniel Ventura, Antonino Ali, and Felipe Rodriguez Silvestre. The question of the legal basis is actually in itself a multifaceted one. Even when dealing specifically with the legality of sanctions, one has to approach this aspect from multiple angles. We know, for example, that several United Nations bodies are wary and critical of unilateral or plurilateral international sanctions, particularly in relation to human rights and humanitarian standards. Let me also refer in this regard to the chapter by Tabassum Jurabi Asadabadi on economic, social, and cultural rights. But one has to be careful not to take the stand by UN bodies as an outright principled opposition to international sanctions as such. It is enough to mention, for example, that several Human Rights Council's special procedures have actually explicitly recommended the use of international sanctions or restrictive measures in combination with other tools to counter human rights or humanitarian law violations in certain extremely grave cases. For example, the Special Rapporteur on Iran advocating for targeted sanctions, or 19 special rapporteurs plus 5 working groups recommending restrictive measures against Israel. Having said that, a broader interdisciplinary approach to international sanctions is crucial, first of all, because of the complexity of the phenomenon. Every sanction expert has, of course, her own specific background. But even if the background is, as in my case, law, it makes little sense to approach as complex a field as sanctions without having at least a basic understanding and knowledge of, say, the economic and political aspects of the key question of effectiveness of sanctions. The findings by The Economist's contribution to the book, Peter van Bergijk and Sajjad Dizagi, was a particularly interesting read in this regard. Secondly, addressing in particular the issue of legitimacy is of crucial importance for understanding key implications behind legal motives. Legality and legitimacy are two distinct categories. Legitimacy of sanctions that Stefano Palestini looked into in his chapter is linked to legality, but is a broader concept in that it also has to do with the outside actors, third actors' perception as to the rightful use of sanctions. Legitimacy has a huge impact, both on a broader political level and in terms of effectiveness of sanctions. Partly related to this, we also have the issue of double standards in the use of sanctions, which is a very serious issue in this field. Alexandra Hofer paid special attention to this aspect in her chapter. Of course, as we learned from international relations experts on sanctions, including Clara and Francesco, especially unilateral, plurilateral sanctions are also a foreign policy tool, and as such, they are therefore inevitably selective. However, full awareness for a lawyer of such critical policy implications is meant to enable lawyers to carefully fine-tune the legal motives with a view to enhancing the legitimacy of sanctions, or in other words, the outside perception of any given sanction package as being legitimate. This, for example, questions the motives provided by the European Union whenever they are laid down mainly in a self-referential European Union law perspective without taking proper account of the relevant international law parameters. The legitimacy vis-à-vis third states or other third actors of the European Union's restrictive measures is at stake, which is all the more delicate in the case of sanction regimes concerning human rights violations that Annalisa Ciampi specifically dealt with in her chapter. In conclusion, with the workshop in Florence in December 2021 and then with this book, we humbly tried to contribute to breaking the ground in the direction of interdisciplinarity. The results of our research and the developments in these last 3 years, the major developments in these last 3 years, show perhaps that this exercise was not far-fetched after all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Antonio, especially for the overview that you've given in reference to many of the chapters that are included in the book, as well as the interesting point about the ways in which there are many sources of demand for the application of sanctions, including from the human rights community itself, which is an interesting potential dilemma to think about. Next, I'm going to turn to Francesco Giumelli, another associate professor, this time from the University of Groningen. And Francesco, the floor is yours.
Tom, thank you very much for this. Thank you very much again for hosting the event. I want to only rectify one thing, that Antonio Bultrini is not the first author only because of alphabetical reasons. He was the real motive and engine and driver of this work. So thank you very much. And I think I speak on behalf of all the editors that Antonio is by far deserving, even if his last name was starting with a Z, then he will still be the first one to be listed. So thank you again, Antonio, for bringing us all together. I'll try to give a little bit of a different presentation for this, because I really want to bring some of my own personal motivation that led me to this work as well. When I started to work on sanctions a couple of years ago, one of the reasons that led me to work on this topic is that if, reading the academic debate, then it was kind of clear the sanctions didn't work. And then you would look at the newspapers, and then that was kind of clear the policymakers had a very different view of sanctions, and that's why sanctions were used all the time. So this lack of policy relevance for the academic debate, me being much younger and with some kind of optimistic view of being an academic, led me to wonder for a number of years, okay, why aren't they listening to us? I mean, who's wrong? Is it us? Are we dumb? Are they dumb? Who is dumb here? There is someone who's making a mistake. And one of the things that I feel was really evident in this project, and one of the things that make us contribute to this academic noise the policymakers are unable to catch is precisely this interdisciplinarity, or these different debates that take place in different silos. So if you do not belong to the silo, then you don't really understand what the others are saying. And then if you are outside of all the silos, so to say, most of the policymakers and the practitioners, then you really don't understand what's going on. And then you take off in another. So for me, this project is really trying to have an interdisciplinary dialogue, try to make, I'm going to make a couple of points, but I'm not going to advocate that one discipline is better or more useful than others. Absolutely not. I think that the debates in all disciplines are very important, and now I refer to law, economics, and political science, or IR. It depends how you define us. But I think that we need to have a mutual awareness of the debates, and that's something that this book starts doing. Of course, it's a journey. This is not the end. This is maybe the beginning of something that we need to continue fostering and somehow nurturing. The idea is that we need to understand what we're talking about, and we need to contribute to each other. And maybe that's a shortcut to make sure that the policymakers also understand more of what it is that we're trying to say. And in a way, at least that worked for me. So reading and working on this book helped me to enhance my understanding of how sanctions can work, and how can we make sure that the work that we do that has an audience, has a better understanding, because the implications, as also Erika very nicely put forward in her preface, the implications of this utilization of these instruments are really broad and sometimes lethal and deadly. So that's why we need to work towards that, and that's why I really appreciated the work that all the authors and the other editors, of course, they have more merits than I had. That we managed to do anyway together. So let me say a couple of considerations in 3 steps, basically, of what I mean by the 3 different understanding. And I'm now referring especially, because that's something I worked on also in my previous life, on the concept of effectiveness and what is effectiveness. Now, step number 1, what I will be trying to, I will be very brief. So I would be even to the point of being not too nice to the disciplines, but again, for the sake of time, I'll try to simplify the debate. So the understanding of effectiveness, what do we mean? So we use the same word, but we mean fundamentally different things. And that's also what was clear in the conference, in the conversation that we had with Antonio before, during, and after, and all the others. When an economist, for example, I'm also supervising a PhD in economics, who works on sanctions effectiveness. And when economists talk about sanctions effectiveness, they really talk about, well, if there is no economic impact, sanctions are not effective. So basically, the understanding of effectiveness is whether there is any sort of economic impact. If you talk to a lawyer, the questions that you ask is fundamentally whether the legality, the legitimacy, are laws being followed, and that is very much, a lot of the attention goes on to these kind of questions. If you talk to a political scientist or to an IR scholar, and then the effectiveness is what happens on the other side. Whatever you're doing is the means, leading you to any ends. What is the target doing? What's happening? Well, now also with the work of Tom, we try to, and we are trying to, we have something on the pipeline, thinking about the audience. So a sanction is not only about the target, it's also about whoever is watching. So there is something more of a question of impact on political behavior of certain targets. And that's a kind of focus for a political scientist or an IR scholar. So again, as I said, in 1 minute, I've already given you three very different directions when you talk about effectiveness that any policymakers that you talk to might actually have already been confused, because then he or she wouldn't know what to do exactly. And then the cleavage between the disciplines is not only in conceptual terms, it's also methodologically. We look at different sources. So it's not I mean, if you talk to a lawyer about sanctions, they're going to be looking at laws and treaties and see whether there is, some sort of either justification or delimitation, or whether, as Antonio said, whether the measures are legal or legitimate. But how do they do this? They look at the laws and the esprit de loi, and they try to analyze what the kind of the behavior the states have according to which kind of legal constraints they have. If we think about economists, they look at the micro and the micro elements. They see what companies do. Are they losing money? Are they divesting, investing on the country? Are they taking risks? What is the stock exchange doing after sanctions are in the air and they're talking about? Well, what happens to investments? What happens, that's something that gives me, actually, this is one of the few things that annoys me from the debate. When you talk about the impact of sanctions, and then you look at, there is inflation and sanctions don't work or they do work. There's a GDP impact of sanctions. Like these discussions to a political scientist, they really don't make much sense, because again, an economist will look at the GDP of Russia. Like with sanctions, the GDP, I mean, it's sometimes completely unrelated. And it's also confusing in many ways. But then a political scientist will be looking at, okay, what does a country want to do? What does a government want to do? Who is gaining out of this behavior? What is the intention? So you would look at, try to read foreign policy behavior through history, through the documents, the speeches, to try to make sense of the objectives of a government in a given time. So again, we look at completely different documents, completely different sources. So our understanding of knowledge is different, and how we collect the evidence is different. And then, of course, it's inevitable that the debate then and the communication across disciplines is impaired somehow by the fact that we looked fundamentally at different sources. And then I'll give you an example. Again, I already gave away my personal understanding of how, for instance, if you take the case of Russia, and then the assessment for an economist would be whether the GDP of Russia is going up and down. This is a war. I mean, in a war economy, sanctions is a very tiny part of the GDP construction. So very often you have a GDP that grows even if you are under sanctions, but because there is an economy of war, and then the GDP goes up because you're producing more than the year before. There's always, I grew up with the story that Germany was producing more guns in January 1945 than in 1940. The GDP maybe even higher, I didn't check this GDP check, than in 1940. But what does it tell us about the trend of the war? Of course, again, we know history, so we know how the story ended. So in Russia, we would be looking at the micro and the macro for an economist. For a lawyer, there's a lot of discussions about the legality of the measures. Now, the most recent discussion is about the assets of the central bank. What can we do with that? Can we use the interest? Can we not? And that is the kind of discussion of a lawyer. If you go to if you talk to the practitioners, well, that would have already, most of them would have already confiscated everything like years ago, because that's, the objective is we need to give money to Ukraine. So that's our problem. And then for the political scientists, it's a bit something in between. What does the law say? And then what are the objectives? What is Putin doing? is enough to put a constraint or to make the military journey more expensive for Russia. And for a political scientist, I said, listen, that is already good enough for sanctions. So again, the way in which we operationalize our different conceptualization of success lead us to very different discussions. So to conclude, I find this interaction very enriching. Somehow we need to make sure that we understand each other. We need to make sure that we understand how these different disciplines can somehow construct a dialogue. At least that's something we also discuss in the conclusion, to build a common vocabulary that allows us to communicate with each other and therefore also to be able to communicate very complicated messages to the outside world, to the policymakers especially, for them to make sense and to use this instrument in a way that could be more effective, and less painful or less problematic. And again, the idea for me that this book, and then I close with this, and that's where I started. For me, one of these personal missions that I have by working on this topic is really to try to enhance the policy relevance of what we do. And I think that this book, thanks to the work of the editors and the authors of the chapters, somehow is a step forward. I don't know how big the step is, but certainly it is a step forward. So thank you again for putting this together. It was a really nice journey. And I hope that you also enjoyed the book.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Francesco. Both for But pointing out, I think very important to point out that within the policy domain, these disciplinary distinctions are not so sharp, although people's background and training, I guess what we do here at the Graduate Institute, leads to certain ways of thinking about these issues. But also your distinction between different ways of thinking about effectiveness across different disciplines is provocative. I can see some ways where they don't necessarily are entirely siloed, but we can take that further in the discussion. Let me turn next to Mirko Sossai from Roma Tre University, who is one of the other editors before we close with Clara's reflections. So Mirko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. First of all, I'm so sorry that I couldn't join in person there in Geneva, but I definitely I'm really grateful for this chance to talk and discuss about this book. And I would like to start by thanking really Antonio for the chance that they gave us to not only to meet at the time of the workshop, but also to continue our conversation with the authors and among ourselves as with respect to the potentialities of interdisciplinary dialogue. And I'm happy that one of the co-sponsors today is MINOS, that confirms actually that the idea of Antonio was really and truly groundbreaking back in 2001. I accepted enthusiastically, I would say, at that time, with respect to the possibility of continuing a dialogue with Francesco and starting one with Clara, because I had the feeling that until very recently, interdisciplinarity in the field of sanctions actually was simply recognizes that we couldn't talk, really. Because at the end of the day, we didn't even agree with respect to the very definition what amounts to sanctions. So these distinctions among international lawyers between categories like institutional sanctions, countermeasures, retortions appeared to a different audience distinctions that couldn't really convey a meaningful message in order to understand the phenomenon of sanctions. Of course, we continue our discussion concerning the issue of legality and using different grounds for justification under international law. But still, I see that it is possible, irrespective of differences with regard to the very definition of multilateral, plurilateral, autonomous sanctions. I see that we can really find a common language. I would like to focus on some thoughts that brought me to contribute then to the conclusions. The first point I would like to make is that the contribution of lawyers to our discussion, I think, was also in terms of who is our audience, I mean, beyond the academics. And I think that there is an audience that goes beyond policymakers, that is more and more interested in the implication of sanctions, and I'm referring to legal practitioners. And this is due to the impressive amount of case law that emerged in the last years within the European Union, but also outside the European Union. And this is something that we tend to forget sometimes. And this is an essential element, I think, of our discussion, the judicial guarantees with respect to the imposition of sanctions. The second point I would like to make is where I see potentialities for further dialogue and collaboration. And I think that one essential element is the development of databases and empirical resources. I have to admit that we, as lawyers, we took advantage of the work of political scientists and economists in collecting evidence and data with respect to the different manifestations of sanctions in previous year. And I have to say that empirical analysis from the viewpoint of international law is a kind of an emerging area of research, and I think it was very fruitful to discuss this, particularly with Clara, because of course when you enter into something new in your research, and I'm referring to my own interest in collecting and handling with databases and empirical analysis, including with respect to case law, and she helped me actually in understanding that also databases have limitations. Sometimes they exclude certain manifestations of the practice, and I'm referring to Africa and Latin America. These areas remain rather undocumented. And of course, there is also the issue of sometimes the risk of losing certain peculiarities in the manifestations of sanctions in certain areas. The third point I would like to briefly focus is the use of comparative analysis. I think this is something that emerges pretty well from the paper written by Tiziana Corda for our book, the importance of expanding the reach of our interest beyond the experiences of the US and the European Union. I see a risk of European hegemonism with respect to the practice of restrictive measures of sanctions, and I think that this book helps to expand the interest into the practice in Africa, in adopting sanctions against the members of the regional and sub-regional organization. I'm thinking to the African Union and ECOWAS practice in particular, and the connections between lists of sanctioned entities between the European Union and ECOWAS. So this is something that attracted my attention. This is definitely, I think, a methodological challenge to overcome this European-centered approach towards regional sanctions. A further area, in my view, of collaboration is with respect to implementation. And I do remember a very groundbreaking contribution in the research has been the book edited by Vera Godwin Debas at the beginning of this century. And still the idea was pretty much that of focusing as lawyers to the legal techniques of implementation. And I think that with the dialogue that we had with economists and IR scholars, we lawyers understood the complexities of implementation that goes beyond I would say, the formal element of the implementing legislation, and that affects also the various actors that are involved in the implementation, including the private actors, of course, particularly in a moment in which financial sanctions are gaining so much importance. True, we are looking for a common language. This is something, and I shared this view with Francesco, that this is, I think, one of the promising outcomes of these common efforts that we had, this book. At the same time, I see that we still continue to think in different terms sometimes. There are issues in any case that continue to have critical importance from a legal viewpoint, particularly with respect to legality. And I think that the chapter by Felipe Rodriguez Silvestre and the work that in Ghent and in other universities, colleagues and scholars and lawyers are doing with respect to extraterritorial reach of sanctions is particularly relevant. Extraterritoriality continues to be an essential topic of discussion among lawyers, and the chapter by Felipe offers a very clear analysis with respect to the very famous practice of secondary sanctions. And at the moment in which the European Union is trying to find ways to remain faithful to the idea of non-extraterritoriality with respect to its restrictive measures, but at the same time, it's trying to expanding the reach of the new packages of sanctions. And I'm referring here to the initiatives taken in order to counter the circumvention of the sanctions against Russia. I think this is, for the future, an area in which we need to continue our research and our analysis. And of course, I see for the European Union a trend towards measures that are close, actually, to the approach by the US. For example, the new no Russia clause for the contracts, or the duty of best efforts for EU companies with respect to non-EU subsidiaries. In conclusion, I see that this book helped me to realize indeed that sanctions are not static and they are not isolated. As lawyers, perhaps by looking to legal texts, we tend to have a static approach. And I think that this kind of exercise allows us to understand the evolving character of sanctions in the current world. And in this respect, I see that this topic is going to allow us to continue our discussion from different viewpoints, but I think also with the enthusiasm of a possible dialogue among us. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Again, thank you, Mirko, very much. First, I think for highlighting the importance of moving beyond a Euro-centered or North American-centered focus on sanctions and looking more globally, comparatively regionally, in the chapters in your book that do highlight that. And also your references to the expansion of extraterritorial claims from multiple jurisdictions, even in China at this point. And then, of course, I have to comment on databases and their exclusions. Being a developer of one of those databases, I'm well aware of the exclusions. But Clara's she's looked at this issue more comparatively. I don't want to preempt what you're going to say. The next speaker is, of course, our last speaker. This is Clara Portela, who actually, the fact that you teach political science in a law school suggests a certain degree of interdisciplinarity in your orientation and outlook. But Clara Portela from the University of Valencia.
Thank you very much. Well, in this final intervention, I don't want to take a lot of time. I just would like to highlight, following up on the theme of interdisciplinarity, how the chapters that, the chapters that are in our book that present analysis following a specific perspective also speak to each other, or at least have interdisciplinary orientations or implications. One of them was authored by a senior Dutch economist called Peter van Bergijk and his collaborator Sajad Disagi. He has actually, well, this chapter has already been alluded to by Antonio. And what this chapter does is actually something really standard in economics, which is to assess the impact of sanctions. But what is interesting about this chapter is, first of all, that it looks into the impact of sanctions on Iran and Russia, which are about the most interesting targets that we have witnessed over the past couple of decades, and that they also use an innovative method in order to conduct this assessment. So other than familiarizing ourselves with the vector autoregressive model, this chapter confirms something that has already been mentioned, well, has already been found in economic research, namely that the economic effect of sanctions wanes over time. And this finding is something that basically encourages us as political scientists to look at how the window of the opportunity for resolving a crisis, precisely when the economic impacts have not reached their peak or have just reached their peak, can be identified and exploited. This is something that basically passes the responsibility to us after the economists have already done their job. The contribution by Tiziana Corda, who is a young Italian political scientist, contributes to something that has been alluded to in several presentations this afternoon, which is basically the fact that sanctions senders are not limited to the West, and we actually have regional organizations in the global South that are becoming increasingly active in the imposition of sanctions. So she inquires whether the accusations of selectivity that have been directed so often to top sanction senders like the United States and also the EU apply to the African Union as well. And she actually highlights, well, other than highlighting this African agency, she also detects that there are certain features of the way in which the legal construct for the imposition of sanctions in the African Union affect, or let's say promote, a certain selectivity that then combines with a general negativity or decreasing enthusiasm for the promotion of democratic governance that has more to do with the geopolitical context and promotes or results in this selectivity. So, I mean, here what is interesting is that the attention paid to regional organizations as senders of sanctions started to be explored in legal scholarship. And it is now establishing itself also among political scientists. So and this also concerns the work of Tom Biersteker and also of Mirko Sossai. They have both looked into regional organizations as senders of sanctions. So this also opens the question as to when economists will also start looking at regional sanctions and their impacts in the same way that they scrutinize the economic effects of the big sanctions senders or the traditional sanctions senders. And well, to conclude, I would also like to allude to the chapter or the analysis presented by Keith Preble, who is a young American political scientist. He looks, well, interestingly, he looks at the arms embargoes imposed by the European Union. And this is interesting to note because actually most research on European Union sanctions has been done in Europe by European scholars. So he actually has a slightly different perspective on how to assess or what to focus on when examining arms embargoes. And he actually highlights that because arms embargoes are imposed with making use of a type of legislation that is typical of the European Union, which is the common possession, it actually allows for ample exemptions and exceptions. So let's say derogations from the general prohibition in the text of the legislation, and also the possibility for member states to deviate from these provisions by making use of exemptions that very much respect the sovereignty of the member states when making decisions on arms supplies. And I mean, this doesn't, of course, this doesn't mean that European Union arms embargoes are not enforced, that they are not implemented properly. Actually, it is the case for very many of them. But I mean, we also have to remember the case of Libya, where arms were being supplied from certain EU countries after the EU had imposed an arms embargo. So looking at how this could happen, despite the existence of a legally binding arms embargo, Keith detects, let's say, the opportunities or these loopholes that could actually be sorted out by a good legal review of how these instruments are being constructed. So again, the responsibility is shifted then to the possible contribution of legal scholars. So all this is to say that even though the chapters are written from a disciplinary perspective, they clearly have implications that encourage us to look at the topic with the tools or using the help of other disciplines. Thank you very much. And the floor is back. Well, you have the floor again, Tom.
Okay. Thank you very much, Clara, again, both for suggesting, as you do also in the conclusion chapter, a broad agenda, excuse me, for future research, and particularly drawing on some of these chapters. And I'm particularly struck by your comment on Peter van Bergijk's chapter. I've co-authored with Peter, and my experience actually reflects your interdisciplinary collaboration. I distinctly remember us having an argument about what are sanctions. And for him, if they weren't economic measures, they weren't sanctions. So he looked at the world only through travel bans, arms embargoes, diplomatic restrictions. These weren't sanctions in his view. But to his credit, I think this chapter is quite interesting. And I see the way in which looking at the impacts over time, there might be windows of opportunity for a topic that I'm interested in, which is how you link sanctions application or sanctions relief to negotiation and to mediation efforts. And so this actually is a very useful way to have a more fine-grained to it. I won't go into that in any more detail. You've been listening. Both we have 18 people online and about the same number in the room at this point. I will, since I can't see who's, I'll make an invitation to those online. If you wish to join us, please raise your hand and I'll come over there and check in the monitor in a moment, but I'll give first right of question or comment from people in the room. I simply ask that when I call on you, that you briefly introduce yourselves. I recognize and know a number of people in the audience, but I don't know everyone. So it also is useful for our speakers. And if you wish to direct your question to a particular speaker, please do. So I'll start with the gentleman here, please. And we have to use the mic so people online can hear your question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Michael Strauss. I am teaching, I'm professor at the Centre d'études diplomatiques et stratégiques in Paris, primarily. And I had a couple of comments / questions about some of the things that have been said. One is about the comment about the effectiveness of sanctions, because it would seem to me that one of the objectives of sanctions that's relatively underplayed and I suspect understudied because I haven't really seen anything about it, is the domestic political benefits to the government of the sanctioning country to be seen as doing something on an issue that can resonate with the population of the sanctioning country. In other words, it's a fairly, sanctions would seem to be a means of trying to get something changed in the sanctioned country, but perhaps it's more important in the sanctioning country where the effectiveness is, if you're considering that it may be a relatively low cost to the sanctioning country's economy, but of relatively great political benefit to the people in the sanctioning country's government who look like they're actually doing something about a problem. Whether what they actually do has any effect may not be that important. So I'm curious about that as this whole area, because I haven't really seen anything. Not to say it doesn't exist, but I just haven't seen it. In terms of the comments, my attorney on this, I believe it was the movement toward economic justifications for sanctions. One of the things that seems to come out of sanctions in a de facto sense is perhaps perversely a support of the WTO's objectives, in the sense that sanctions de facto cause sanctioning countries to expand their international business and trade ties with countries that they hadn't necessarily done business with or done business as much with before. We see this in particular with the Russian sanctions. So it kind of expands the structure of international trade to encompass more countries interacting with each other. And that I find rather interesting. Again, I haven't seen any studies about this, so this may be an area for future research. I have other comments, but I'll leave it at that because I'm sure there are other people who have better comments.
All right, thank you very much for that. Any responses online yet? Okay, not yet. Okay, then I think I saw Jean-Luc. Yeah.
Thank you, Gianluca Bucci, Graduate Institute. Many thanks for this very, very interesting panel. I must say it brings back memories, because in my previous life I was working in the Office of the Legal Counsel of the United Nations in the 90s. And even though in a sort of junior capacity, I was one of the focal points of the economic sanctions. So it brings back. Then I moved away from the UN and totally changed topic. So in a way, some of the thoughts that I had is how much things have changed. And one of the aspects is, at the time, at least within the frame of the UN, it was surprising how there wasn't much of an effort by, in particular, the P5, but also other countries, in having a more thorough assessment of the impact, go back to the issue of effectiveness, or they try to conceptualize oops, somebody is dissenting from me, of trying to have more clarity, almost by clinical clarity, on the impact on the target states, but also on the implementation by member states. There wasn't much of an effort to collect information in what states were doing. So almost the messaging effect of sanction, the symbolic effect, or as Professor Strauss says, the effect on the audience within the sanctioning country seem to be probably politically more important than a clinical assessment of what states are doing. So I wonder how much things have changed. For example, in the context of plurilateral sanction, where there must be some mechanism for assessment, both on implementation and on the impact of the target countries. And then a question just in reaction to what Erika was saying. there seem to have the UN stalling in terms of being the main sender of sanctions and the movement of this away to bilateral, plurilateral sanctions. And I wonder why that's the case, whether there is a tension within the Security Council or there are broader political issues. And also what Erika said of the return to comprehensive sanctions that I thought had been more or less delegitimized by the very bad experiences in Iraq, in Haiti, in Yugoslavia in the 90s, and the movement to targeted sanction to increase a sense of legitimacy, not starving a whole country just to target a few decision makers. Why this movement back to comprehensive sanction? What is the reason for that? Thank you.
Okay, I see more hands, but I think we now have 4 questions. So let's try to address the 4 questions we have before us. Questions on effectiveness of domestic political benefits of sanctions, economic justifications, friendshoring, expanding trade, assessments, and whether or not we're returning to comprehensive. Unfortunately, Erika had to leave, so she can't respond, but I'm happy to respond in her place if you want. But I won't do that right now. Let's perhaps start the first one on, I can see Francesco likely to have something to say about the first question, and anyone else on the panel, Mirko, is welcome to comment as well.
No, thanks. I think Tom was referring to the question on the objectives of sanctions, whether the domestic audience has something. Indeed, this is also what I've been, working on for a while. The concept is there, has been there for a while. There are things being written in the 80s and the 90s that talk about how important that is. There's also a very effective title of a book called Doing Good or Feeling Good with Sanctions, something like this. And I think that speaks exactly around that. I think the understanding is derogatory in the sense that they are not effective. You just do it for the sake of doing. I think that doing this with a political objective for a domestic audience is actually exactly what a public policy very often has to do. And I think there have been examples. There is still some practice. I haven't seen as well, and that's something maybe we want to work on a systematic and comprehensive analysis of all these kind of different, when do we have sanctions because the domestic audience needs to be somehow deliver the message. We have studies with the Cuban cases of sanctions imposed in 1996. Again, there is a connection with the minority, the Cuban minority within the US, for instance. That's something that we argued in a couple of things that we wrote about the sanctions imposed on Russia in July 2014 that were after the MH17 crash. And again, domestic audience rather than necessarily changing the dynamic of an event. So indeed, long story short, I haven't seen systematic and comprehensive studies of all cases of sanctions, both Western and non-Westerners. But at the same time, the point has been raised and covered in the literature. And I hope I also contributed with my work, but some of these people here have also done that, but not systematically. So the problem is there. We need to measure it comprehensively. I would leave it at that. Otherwise, I can say more things, but I'm sure that I shouldn't.
I can offer a footnote at least on and drawing on some of Francesco's earlier work that we adapted in the Targeted Sanctions Consortium research here at the Graduate Institute. We made the argument that virtually all sanctions, UN sanctions now I'm talking about, are intended to send signals. And they're sending signals not only to the target, but to others, both domestically and internationally. So that's another way of thinking about that issue analytically. Others on, we have other questions though. We also have the question about the expansion of trade, assessments, which I think is a very important one, particularly from within the UN, and a question about why the UN has stalled.
That's for you.
That's for me. Well, I'll make a quick comment on that. We can talk much more extensively about it. We've been tracking, there were 25 UN sanctions regimes between 1990 and 2015. There have only been 2 since. Every year for the past 5 years, the UN has delisted more people than listed. And a lot of it has to do with a breakdown. It's even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but a breakdown of consensus and cooperation. 2 things have happened. I think after the turnaround over Libya in 2011, when China and Russia abstained on a resolution, and then the P3 declared the new goal was to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. That triggered a major debate internally within Russia and turning very much against sanctions. So I dated even 10 years ago, we can see that evidence. But with regard to the other interesting development is that China has become much more engaged and assertive with regard to sanctions. It's interesting to note that the most recent sanctions regime applied by the UN in 2022 was actually initiated by China, not by the US, the new regime on Haiti. So we're seeing these dynamics in the Council. And some interesting, it's not completely dysfunctional, however. So obviously I'd be out of business with sanctions, UN sanctions app if we were completely finished with sanctions. There are areas where there's interesting developments underway. So it's changed, but it's not completely gridlocked or hopeless. Although I do think Erica is right to emphasize the dynamic and what I call informal multilateralism, maybe plurilateral. I'm not sure if it's plurilateral, but informal multilateralism with regard to sanctions. That may well be the future, and that's something of international sanctions, something that several of us are going to be discussing at the next International Studies Association meeting in Chicago next year. But I shouldn't be giving answers to these questions. Mirko does. Okay, good. Mirko.
Thank you, Tom. Maybe a turning point, just to add what you have just said with respect to turning back to more comprehensive sanctions on the one hand, and the issue of plurilateralism. A turning point is, in my view, also Syria. Syria is a situation in which it was not possible because of the opposition of one of the P5 to even consider the possibility of sanctions within the Security Council. And it was in that context, indeed, that there were attempts to coordinate the listed individuals among the different countries, and in particular, with respect to certain political initiatives of partnership against the use of chemical weapons. So it was in that moment that actually we see the attempt also to find a sort of plurilateral coordination with respect to targeted measures against a certain Syrian leaders. What I see with respect to comprehensive sanctions is actually the fact that on the one hand, targeted sanctions are not over. I mean, there was a moment in which we thought probably that the future was just smart sanctions. But in reality, what we see is that on the one hand, the situation has evolved in the sense of horizontal sanctions regimes with no connection with the territory. And I'm thinking to the Magnitsky-style regimes. At the level of the European Union, it's not just the human rights sanctions regime, but also the chemical weapons, the one against cyber acts. On the other hand, when states are involved, we see actually a returning of more comprehensive measures. Also for reasons related to how events evolved. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually is a manifestation of the fact that indeed states could use a tool in order to target Russia as a whole. But maybe I'll stop here.
Great. No, thanks very much for bringing in a reference to the Syrian case in particular, as well as the comprehensive. Other comments on this first round of questions?
I have one, but let's see here from the room.
Let's open it up. I know there was a hand here before and here as well. So we'll start there and then come here. And then no one online yet?
No, for the
okay.
time being.
Thanks. All right.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their valuable insights and expertise with us today. And my name is Yasser Sadarian from Permanent Mission of Iran in Geneva. Needless to say that these are my personal views, not my official positions in the mission. From legal point of view, the legality of sanctions in international law have raised many discussions in the between lawyers and academia. And who defines what is the illegal sanctions and what are the legal sanctions, and what we calling them as the unilateral sanctions or multilateral sanctions, plural sanctions, irrespective of what we calling it. We calling it unilateral sanctions because they are illegal, and who defines that these sanctions are illegal? I should mention the articles for responsibility states for wrongful acts. In Article 14.9 defines that states can take countermeasures against another state to bring that state to comply with its obligations. In this regard, when we assume that the sanctions falls within the category of countermeasures, some states can take these countermeasures and sanctions against another state. But the Article 50 of the 50 of the Article of Responsibility States for Wrongful Act says that it prohibits states to taking countermeasures that touch and affecting fundamental rights, such as human rights. In this regard, the UN Special Rapporteur for Unilateral Coercive Measures has documented many reports that say that this type of sanctions are illegal because their effects on human rights and individuals in the targeted states are undeniable. So, from the panelists said that they mentioned the special rapporteur advocating for imposing sanctions on states, but we have a special rapporteur, especially in this issue, that have documented many reports that she says that these sanctions are illegal, and she documented the effect of sanctions on the people in the targeted states. So I would like to pose questions for the panelists. Do you have documented? Have you mentioned any arguments with the special rapporteur on UCM in your books about the effect of sanctions on human rights and also the illegality of sanctions in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And then here in the front, or not exactly the front row, but 2 rows down.
Hi, I have many hats, but here as a former PG, right, from the Institute, I think my question is very simple in a way, but when you talk about the evolution of sanctions going to comprehensive and other types of, are we seeing a progressive prominence of the purpose of constraint signaling over coercion? Because if you go into back in the 1990s, and there's a whole idea that, and then the whole disconnect probably of sanctions is if you apply the sanction, you try to coerce the target to change behavior. However, if you see many of the sanctions of the last 10 years or 5 years, we see a lot of sanctions whose purpose is basically to constrain the ability of the actor, right? Russia, nobody thinks that Russia is going to change behavior because of the sanctions, or no one asked that China would stop, for example, developing advanced chips because there is a trade sanction against chip development. It's basically constrained, and also kind of signaling both internally and nationally. So maybe what I'm trying to think is are we seeing a moment where the policy making maybe is moving to an understanding of sanctions as a tool to constrain a target or signaling to audience or targets more than actually trying to coerce anything? And in that case, could be a reason, or one of the main reasons, that we go to more comprehensive or more blunt instruments. Because here you are trying to constrain a war machine, for example, or you are trying to constrain a whole industry of development of industry. And in the same case for maybe some of the regional organizations where we don't really expect the regime to go back to a pre-coup state, but you want to signal that unconstitutional change of government is a bad thing. So are we moving to more like blunt instruments just because the purpose also are more diverge a little bit from what used to be in terms of the understanding? But yeah, thank you.
Okay. Interesting hypothesis or question about why we might be seeing. We might even want to comment on whether we agree that the norm has been degraded and whether comprehensive sanctions are more the norm. Let me put that to our panelists. I think Clara has something to say right away.
Thank you. Well, I think that it's intriguing to look at that possible connection, but I don't necessarily see both phenomena related, because this return to comprehensive sanctions is a trend that had started earlier. And it's not a trend that affects every sender of sanctions. I think that it goes particularly for the big traditional sanctions, unilateral sanction senders. So the US, the EU, and their G7 partners. But actually the research that Tom has been leading on UN showed that UN sanctions were becoming more targeted, not more comprehensive. So,
with one exception, the DPRK.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in general,
Yeah, no, you're right.
the trend, this trend was not observable in the case of the UN by and large. So you had some return to comprehensive sanctions by unilateral actors, but the UN was, when it was still imposing sanctions, it was mostly keeping its course that sanctions should remain targeted. And even if we look at the big big senders or the top senders, such as the EU, I mean, the EU has become, well, has been making an increasing use of blunt, very comprehensive sanctions with regard to Russia. But if we look at what the EU is doing in Burundi or Venezuela, it is still very targeted. So there seems to be like two different strands developing, like the sanctions against major geostrategic competitors or really worrying countries, and then democracy crisis in the global south. And then you have different policies at play. While this trend towards imposing sanctions that are more far-reaching and that seek a bigger impact in economic terms, I think that this can be much more seen as a new emphasis, or really a new emphasis on implementation and enforcement, because implementation and enforcement was always supposed to be optimal, but nobody was really checking. And then all of a sudden, I mean, we have a lot of focus on whether things are being implemented properly, and then there's a lot of evasion and circumvention that is being detected. And right now, there's a lot of thinking being done as to how this can be averted, at least on the European continent, because in the US, the situation is different. It has always been a concern to them. But in the case of the EU, this really started with the invasion of Ukraine 2022. Now, perhaps I can say something else connecting to another topic, taking advantage from my intervention. I think that the moment in which the evolution that we have seen at the UN Security Council has to do, has to do perhaps much more with the 2014 invasion of Crimea than with the 2022 all-out invasion of Ukraine. Because this attempt to delegitimize unilateral sanctions by the UN, particularly the UN General Assembly, later also by the UN Human Rights Council, this has been going on for decades. It started already at the Cold War, in Cold War times. So it has a long history. But the idea was really to make a difference between the sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, which were supposed to be completely legal, completely legitimate, and be completely out of question, while those that were imposed outside the UN Security Council, they were contrary to the law. At least this is the discourse that that these resolutions were framing. But after 2014, what we have seen is a sharp decrease in the frequency with which new sanctions regimes are applied. And until we are almost at a complete stop. So that the idea that sanctions should be regarded as having a different legal status, depending on whether they come from the UN Security Council or they come from other senders, this has evolved into sanctions should not be around at all. There shouldn't be any sanctions, like the tool is completely out of place and it's illegitimate. And I think that we are slowly moving towards this evolution. And I wonder whether, I think that Antonio looks very skeptical at the moment, so perhaps you're not.
No. Maybe we'll come on something else. But
okay,
I'm intrigued, not skeptical.
I'm going to turn to you on the legal issues for a moment. Just a quick comment on Clara's last intervention. I think I think you're right that there has been, looking at this from the UN standpoint. You mentioned that we're at a stall, but it's also important to remember that there are currently 15 UN sanctions regimes ongoing. So that's a total of 50% of the entire UN sanctions regimes from its founding in 1945. So there's still that much going on. But you're right about the bifurcation. What you described in the EU is exactly at the UN. We have these very, very, very strongly targeted, a handful of individuals under 10 or 12 as being, and sometimes just a travel ban, not anything else other than travel restrictions. And then you have DPRK. And that's in a completely different category. And it's one of the unusual within the UN system, open-ended sanctions regimes. That regime is not up for renewal on a periodic basis, unlike virtually all the other regimes. But just maybe more than a footnote comment. But perhaps Antonio could come back on the interesting and very important question about our colleague Elena Duhan, who we have some contacts with, and I must say I interacted quite a good deal more with her predecessor, Ambassador Jazeri, when he was in that position. But I'd be interested. I'm not a lawyer, so I'd be interested in a lawyer's response. So I'll turn to first Antonio, and then
probably Mirko will have a say on this as well. But let me reassure Clara, I was not skeptical. It was just thought-provoking. I was thinking, although I looked. Now, briefly, because we don't have much time left, and I'm sure that Mirko will want to have a say on the issue you raised, which concerns really legality. And generally speaking, we look for a legal basis rather in Article 54 of Articles on State Responsibility, which concerns lawful measures that states can take to react to breaches of international law that affect the international community as a whole. That would be really the legal, even though in substance they by and large correspond. The lawful measures, they by and large correspond to countermeasures. Indeed, it's the last article of that section, not by chance, of the articles. But when the Article 54 was drafted, they didn't agree on what exactly to put into that. So the later practice then led to what we now call actually collective countermeasures. Okay, so the term is lawful measures, but in substance it corresponds to collective countermeasures, which is also a term which is now very commonly used. So that would be where we look for the very starting point. Of course, human rights and all possible humanitarian adverse effects. Now, by chance, as you certainly know, the European Union recently adopted a set of rules regarding humanitarian exemptions, and the two do not contradict each other. That's why I wanted to refer to this apparently striking situation where a UN human rights special rapporteur, by the way, the special rapporteur on Iran, as you know, is not from a Western state, advocating for targeted sanctions, although it's a human rights procedure, okay? And of course, being fully aware of the fact that, as we all know, there can be adverse effects. You have to pay attention to that. You have to embody that assessment into any decision concerning sanction regimes. But in this regard, I also want to refer to the complexity of things. Some adverse effects on human rights may not actually come from the sanction measures as such. And I'm referring to the very important role of private actors and to what we call overcompliance. Okay? So sanctions are decided by whether governments or the European Union or other organizations, okay? But then the implementation is actually to a very significant extent to private actors who may then private actors, by their very nature, do not want to take risks. If in case of doubt, then they stop. They will not. They will stop exporting a given product. Now, in the case of Iran is a very interesting one because there's a rare dermatological disease for which you have a specific drug which is produced by one manufacturer only, which is a Swedish firm, okay? And the Swedish firm decided to stop the exporting this very specific drug to Iran. So you must not underestimate the very significant role, especially when it comes to overcompliance, that private actors actually play in this field. And then again, also to save time, since I have the microphone, very briefly on this phenomenon of going back to comprehensive sanctions, I think it's at least partly related also to the nature of the threats we are confronted with. Right yesterday on the plane, when I was flying to Geneva, I was reading an article concerning how what can be done to deter. I'm not a diplomat, so I'm going to speak very openly, okay? To deter China from invading Taiwan. Okay, so when you consider the options you have, it's not very targeted, okay? And not even, it's not necessarily going to work also because of another phenomenon that we must not neglect, which is going to change the sanction landscape, okay? Very soon, some states are gaining, the capability of some states to resist sanctions is growing, okay? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Interesting and provocative comment. Mirko, do you wish to comment further on international legal aspects?
Very briefly, Tom, I think Antonio summarized very well the debate around the very content on Article 54 of the draft Articles on State Responsibility with respect to the issue of collective countermeasure. Maybe the only thing I can signal is that if you look at the debate within the G7 with respect to the issue of confiscation of the central bank assets of Russia, and Francesco mentioned, well, you will realize that indeed one of the key topics for discussion was indeed whether a confiscation of assets could be justified on the basis of the category of countermeasures under international law, and it appears very well that that state at a certain moment relied on the draft articles and tried to develop a legal argument based on the idea that actually those freezing and then confiscating the assets were not simply non-affected states, which is precisely the language of the draft articles, but they were specially affected states as well. I cannot enter into the debate, but it's just to confirm the fact that indeed the whole debate concerning the issue of a third party or collective countermeasures is not only the main rift between the Western countries and those opposing the reliance on unilateral measures, but also within the context of the G7, it was one of the most debated issues.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that further intervention. I'm afraid it is too late. Yeah, because we've actually gone over our time and we started a bit late, but we've now already used up that additional time, I'm afraid. Let me just conclude. If you enjoyed this conversation or discussion, we have another book launch in a month from now. It will be Peter Wallenstein and Armen Bekai, who are going to be speaking on their just recently published last month book, Sanctions for Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. That will be here or somewhere else in the Institute, and possibly 2 other events, one perhaps focusing particularly on Iran. I'll let you know more details if you're on our mailing list. I'll let you know about that. But please join me in thanking our participants online and in person, and congratulations on a really interesting new book.